So just to clarify a couple of terms, there's a lot of terms used in the concept, and it's good to have some time just to go through each one and define it, put words onto it, so that our understanding of the term becomes more and more accurate, which then means we can see what the term is really pointing at more and more clearly. So there's a lot of terms, words that get used together. So for example, biological reaction and psychological reaction, pleasure and pain, peace and suffering, free will and God's will. Let's see, what else? Well, all the different forms of blame, all the different forms of suffering, blame, guilt, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcome. There are words like awareness, being, consciousness, manifestation and unmanifest, experience, momentary arising. So lots of terms that are used over and over again. And so I'll start with some of them, and if any of them are not clear for anyone, well, actually we could start, if there's, instead of me starting at the beginning, I was going to talk about the difference between biological reaction and psychological reaction. If someone has a preference to speak about another term in particular, because it's one they don't understand, then let me know, otherwise we'll talk about biological and psychological.
Can you, it doesn't have to be the first one, but you mentioned... you don't have to start with this, but could you just mentioned consciousness, awareness, and being, or those three. Can you cover that also, the distinction among the three?
Okay. Well, I'll start with psychological and biological reactions, and then we'll go on to those other more ephemeral terms, or terms that are pointing at something more ephemeral, I should say. So biological reaction and psychological reaction, to put it into context, the teaching says whatever happens in each moment is the flow of life. The flow of life is either pleasure or pain. And included in the flow of life are biological reactions. Biological reactions are the way that the body responds or reacts in a particular situation based on the circumstance that is there. And so the biological reaction of the body is part of the flow of life. The flow of life in this teaching doesn't refer to the attitude to the flow of life. Now, all of life, the whole experience of life, includes both the flow of life, which is biological, and the attitude to the flow of life. So in the complete experience of life, both are included. In the flow of life, what is referred to as the flow of life is the circumstance that we find ourselves in and the biological reaction of the body. Now, the biological reaction of the body is not limited to just the physical functioning of the body. The biological reaction of the body can include thoughts. As long as those thoughts come from the working mind, then they are part of the biological reaction. So the working mind and the thinking mind are very closely linked to the concept of biological reaction and psychological reaction. Biological reactions include movements of the physical body and functions of the working mind, and also functions of certain emotions that are not suffering emotions. So excitement, for example, or anger when it's a biological reaction of anger and doesn't include blame in it. Even sadness when it doesn't include grief in it is a biological reaction. Hunger is a biological reaction. The thinking of how much money to take on holiday with me is a biological reaction. So a whole lot of biological reactions which can range from physical, emotional, or mental. So this biological reaction is anything that happens in the body as a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning that are not up-to-date conditioning that forms part of the thinking mind. Any movement of the thinking mind, which is based on a particular type of conditioning, the conditioning which includes all of the beliefs that I am the doer, that the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in the flow of life. Any movement of mind that includes those beliefs at their core is psychological reactions. It's the thinking mind functioning. And those reactions are reactions that are in relation to what is happening in the flow of life. They are not reactions that are part of the flow of life. So the psychological reaction is on the level of my attitude to life. The biological reaction is a reaction that happens on a biological level, not a psychological level, meaning if someone were to drop hot wax on my hand, there would be a biological movement away from the hot wax. If someone were to tell me that someone that I love has died, there can be an emotional reaction that will arise that is sadness, pain in the moment. So all biological reactions will be either pleasure or pain because they're part of the flow of life. And remember, the flow of life is either pleasure or pain. So if someone tells me that someone that I love has died, then there will be this arising of sadness, and that will be a biological reaction, assuming it doesn't get turned into a feeling of uncomfortableness with the situation. A feeling of uncomfortableness means a feeling that has gone beyond the biological, meaning beyond just outside of my preference, and has been related to as something that is an attack on who I am. So these are quite fine distinctions that are important if we're going to start seeing what arises clearly. So the psychological reactions that arise are categorized in general terms as suffering, and in more specific terms we are defining the suffering in 5 different categories: guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So any movement of the mind that is expecting life to be a certain way, that expects life to be a certain way because there is the belief that my happiness is dependent on outcomes. Any movement of mind that is anxious or worryful, and that movement of mind that I'm talking about isn't necessarily limited to just thinking. It can also be feelings of suffering, because thoughts in their intense form, in their concentrated form, stop looking like thoughts and start feeling like feelings. So suffering in its intense form is not seen as a thought, but felt as a feeling. But actually, when we go into that feeling, we find that there's a story, there's a thought behind it. And that thought is a product of the thinking mind, a psychological reaction, a reaction to what is happening in the flow of life. So biological reaction is a reaction as part of the flow of life, which can include the moving away of the hand from hot wax. It can include thinking about seeing the hot wax about to fall on my hand because someone's carrying a candle and it's about to tip, and the thought, oh, that looks like that wax is about to fall off the candle onto my hand. That thinking is simply observing the flow of life, and it is part of the flow of life. So that thinking about the wax falling onto my hand is a biological reaction as a result of seeing something in the flow of life. When the wax falls on the hand and I move my hand out because it's hot, the next thought, which could be of blaming the person for what they have done to me, which is no longer in the flow of life, the blaming for what they have done, which has caused pain to me, that is attitudinal. That is my attitude to what has happened in the flow of life. And that is a psychological reaction. So in these talks, it's highlighted that human happiness is not to be found in pleasure, is not to be found in the flow of life. The flow of life is either pleasure or pain. So human happiness is not to be found in our biological reactions, which means that we don't need to be or become the perfect human being. Biologically, the body is going to function exactly as it's designed based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance it finds itself in. And our happiness is not to be found in the body functioning a particular biological way. It also points out that our happiness is not to be found in our attitude to life, when our attitude is coming from the beliefs in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. That is our unhappiness. Our attitude to life, such that we believe that we are the doers and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, that is not my happiness but my unhappiness. And furthermore, it is suggested that human happiness is the absence of human unhappiness, which really means the absence of a certain attitude to life, meaning the absence of a certain set of psychological reactions to life. And it turns out that our happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, as I've just discussed. Our happiness is to be found in our attitude to life, and that attitude is the absence of the psychological reaction or the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome. The working mind is the part of the mind or the brain that is based on a person's genes and up-to-date conditioning. And the genes and up-to-date conditioning that makes up the working mind don't include conditioning that adds to the belief my happiness is to be found in outcomes and I am the doer and the other is the doer. The genes and up-to-date conditioning that make up, or actually it's much more the up-to-date conditioning that makes up the thinking mind, the psychological mind, where the psychological reactions happen, are conditioning that adds to those beliefs. And so when we look at it, both the biological reaction and the psychological reaction, if they happen, are in principle the same, a result of the genes and up-to-date conditioning that we weren't in control of. So both the biological and the psychological reaction is not my doing, but a happening. So the reason that we separate the two is not because one is something I do and the other is something that happens. They're both fundamentally happenings, But to understand the distinction, the biological reaction is always going to happen in life. The biological reaction is part of the flow of life. But the psychological reaction is based on a very particular set of ingrained beliefs about who we are and what we need in order to be complete, that life can dissolve. We can find ourselves without an idea of who we are, and that is the end of the thinking mind, the end of the psychological reactions to life. And so the differentiation is just to show that one is biological and part of the flow of life, and the other is attitudinal, an attitude to the flow of life. But we still have to bear in mind that both of them are based on the same principle of genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors that we've never been in control of. And so when psychological thinking, which is suffering, arises and is seen to be there, is registered, is witnessed, then when it's seen to be there, hopefully there is an understanding that says this is suffering, this is psychological reaction, this is my attitude to what is happening in the flow of life, but it's here because of a specific type of genes and up-to-date conditioning, not my doing. So that means that there is the potential for the suffering to be understood as suffering, to be understood as an attitude to the flow of life and not the flow of life, but also to be understood to be something that is a happening and not my doing. The biological reaction, also a happening based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance I find myself in. Also, not my doing. And knowing that my happiness is to be found in my attitude, it's very important to understand that these pointers are not suggesting, one, that anyone does anything to change this. These are not prescriptions of something to do, but rather descriptions of the functioning of life, descriptions of what might happen, what changes might happen, and the mere fact that the descriptions are being delivered not by a doer, but by a biological robot or instrument, which is what the body is on a biological and psychological level. The fact that those descriptions are being delivered means it's life throwing new conditioning at another biological instrument, and the descriptions become part of our up-to-date conditioning. Hopefully, they don't become seen as a set of prescriptions of something to do. Hopefully they are recognized as just information that will then drive the working mind and drive awareness to be able to see life along these lines. And if it's taken on by the thinking mind, by the doer, by the psychological reaction, and becomes something that I, as the doer, must achieve, it will create its own new suffering. It will be new suffering. And hopefully at some point, awareness and the working mind will recognize that this new suffering is arising, and the working mind will then investigate what is happening in the thinking mind, what psychological reactions are happening that are creating this extra suffering. And what we'll see is that the thinking mind, the doer, has decided, has received this, it hasn't decided, but it's received this information, and the information, instead of being absorbed in such a way that it just becomes a description, has been absorbed such that it's taken as a prescription. And when it's taken as a prescription, the doer continues to function, which means more suffering. And as soon as awareness lands on the fact that this has happened, the error can get corrected. So as we were talking before, the irony of life, the catch-22 is that if the doer is there functioning, trying to get somewhere, trying to achieve something, trying to understand the nature of life, trying to bring about the end of suffering, that in itself is more suffering. And so if the solution for human happiness is the end of suffering, the solution is for the doer to stop. The doer can't take that on as a job, because if it does, it's not stopping, it's continuing. And so, like magic, at some point in time, just as we are functioning, the dynamic is seen in an instant, and the understanding in the working mind arises, stop. And the stopping happens when we least expect it. If someone is trying to make stopping happen, as soon as the notion of stopping comes in, and then there is a movement after the notion of stop, a movement of mind to try and stop, that's not stopping, that's the opposite. So stopping is something that just happens at a particular point in time, and I'm making it sound like stop is this big thing that just, like a thunderbolt from heaven. It's not really like that. We can stop 20 times in a day, maybe just for a second each time. The more that stopping is understood to just be a stop, then the more easy it is that the more often it happens. I hope we can see there's a difference between stop and I need to stop. Okay, now how do I stop? I'm going to work really hard at stopping, and if I put enough effort into stopping, I'm going to stop. And the same sort of thing happens when this process starts at some point. In particular, everyone has their own path. I'm familiar with people on this path. Once the up-to-date conditioning is such that the concepts have started to seep into the system, then we can't help but just go about our life with no mission to investigate. And then investigating just happens. So we stub our toe, and then the thought might arise, as well as the pain. That's pain in the moment. And often, along the way, a certain set of dynamics will happen through the day. And, for example, in the dynamic of, let's say, locking our keys out of the car, which is part of the flow of life. It's pain in the moment. It was a set of biological reactions and circumstance that meant keys were locked in the car. And we look in the window and we see keys locked. Oh, keys locked in the car. Yeah. And then that, we could say is a biological reaction. But then the moment that the mind starts thinking and starts blaming oneself or blaming someone else for making us lock the keys in the car, as soon as that happens, that's the attitude of guilt and blame happening, which is our suffering about what is happening in the flow of life. And without us even having an intention to investigate, in a particular moment, it might just click. It might just, for the first time, become really clear at what suffering is and what the flow of life is. And we don't have to do that. In fact, we can't do it. Life will have all of these moments of insights dropping. Just once the body has been primed with the concepts, at a certain point in time, circumstance will present, and a click in relation to the concepts will happen. And that click is when we really see it for ourselves, when we really see in action, in our own life experience, what the concepts are pointing to. And we can't orchestrate that. We can't manufacture this insight. We can't make it happen by saying, okay, today I'm going to figure out the difference between the flow of life and my attitude to the flow of life. If we try to make it happen like that, that's the doer again, going beyond just understanding the concept and now trying to make the concept turn into a deeper understanding. That's the doer, and it's not going to happen. To the extent that we just relax and keep living our day, living our life, we'll start seeing that thoughts arise in relation to what's happening, contemplation happens, and insights start happening. So very much like the story I often mention, the one I mentioned this morning about the monkey, the intellectual understanding was given that if you smile at a monkey, it's going to take it as a sign of aggression. That was in my system. And then one day a circumstance happened that I smiled at a monkey without intending to smile at the monkey. The smile came, the monkey jumped back, and in fright and fear, and there was a click in that moment that I didn't manufacture. I didn't manufacture any of the circumstance. It happened, and when the concept that had told me, which was just theoretical at that point, that when I smile at a monkey is going to take that as a sign of aggression. In that moment, the concept went deeper. It became part of my deeper understanding because I saw it for myself in action. And so in the same way, when we see something like what pleasure and pain is really pointing at in the flow of life, maybe on a level that we didn't recognize before. So for example, love, the feeling of love. Okay, we hear everything in the flow of life is pleasure or pain. But then we say, oh, but love is different. So we might not say that in our head, but it's been categorized differently. And one day, we might find ourselves going along and doing something, and someone does something for us out of the blue when we haven't asked for it. And this feeling arises inside of us, a feeling that we could call love, let's say, or gratitude, and in that moment it might click. This is pleasure in the moment, part of the flow of life, a biological reaction. And it's not because we manufacture this insight, it just happens. And we say, oh, until now I understood that pleasure in the moment is having a nice chocolate cake, or pleasure in the moment is watching a good movie. But I didn't realize that this feeling of gratitude, this feeling of love, this more intangible feeling, or not intangible, but less objective feeling, that's pleasure in the moment too. And it just clicks, so the understanding goes down to a deeper level. And the same with a feeling of sadness about something that someone has done to us that doesn't include blame. And we just feel sad when let's say we just change what I've just said. We hear a story about some incident that touches us, but it's also sad. And in the moment, then, because we've been equipped with the concept that says the flow of life is pleasure or pain, in that moment, it might click, oh, this is pain in the moment. This is sadness as a biological reaction. There's no guilt or blame associated with it. And so slowly, and sometimes quickly, the concepts sink in, and now life is seen clearly. Life is seen for what it is, and when it's seen for what it is, a lot of the former mistakes fall away, the former false beliefs fall away, and things become much better. Much better, not on the flow of life, but on the attitudinal level. We're still, I guarantee you, going to lock our keys in the car. We're still going to have hot wax spilt on us. We're still going to stub our toe and we're still going to have bad food. We're still going to have very enjoyable moments where the warm shower is the most required or the most appreciated thing in that moment. We're still going to have moments where people do unexpected acts or perform unexpected acts of kindness, and we're going to feel great. So on the flow of life, nothing's going to change. We're still going to be an imperfect human being with shortcomings. So we might be short-tempered, we might not be as emotional as someone would like us to be, we might not be as available as someone wants us to be, and that is my biological reaction in the moment, and it could still deliver pain to the others. As long as my attitude is, well, this is life unfolding, I might be able to do it better. I've heard, I've seen, as a result of this moment, that this reaction causes pain for you. That's now become part of my up-to-date conditioning, and in the future, I may well act differently. But for now, I apologize, but I couldn't have acted differently. We don't need to say that to someone when we're apologizing, but we know it for ourselves. Right? If we say that in an apology, it maybe isn't received so much as an apology. So knowing that I couldn't have acted differently, but seeing that what I did delivered pain, doesn't preclude me from saying, I'm sorry that what happened hurt you. It wasn't my intention. So, consciousness, awareness, and
actually, before you go into that, just a quick question on when you say that life orchestrates events and then something clicks, something that you understood intellectually before. Is that understanding, does that belong to the working mind? I mean, what is it that is clicking?
Yeah, you see, this is great because so often we're told that enlightenment has nothing to do with the intellect. The process of enlightenment has everything to do with the intellect. So we need to be very specific and clear on exactly what is happening. We don't have to, I mean, people will say, well, you don't have to overthink it. Sure, you find there's a lot of seekers in life that remain seekers, and on the one hand, overthinking it as a doer is the problem. But my experience is that when life starts to bring clarity in place, then we find ourselves in a place where a lot of change has happened, a place that allows us to be much more peaceful in life. And when you listen to teachers teaching, their teaching might not include a lot of concepts in it, because the teaching is designed to bring about a different, or to deal with a different problem. But I think it's fair to say, if you have enough exposure to the teacher and understand, hear the stories about their path, their process, you'll find that it included a lot of contemplation. Now, what is contemplation? When Buddha was sitting under the tree, contemplating, he was thinking. That was the working mind, thinking about things and saying, yeah, no, that can't be that, and looking at his own experience and thinking. And at some point, I think he decided he was going to live on 1 grain of rice a day. Now, that was a thought that arose to do that for a particular purpose, and then certain conclusions. I think it's when he had lost a certain amount of weight and was physically not very capable, a thought arose, no, this isn't the answer. So a lot in the process, a lot of thinking happens. And so enlightenment itself is not intellectual. Enlightenment itself is not something, it's not a mental attitude towards life. Enlightenment is the reconnecting to the essence, the core of who the human being is, and knowing oneself at one's core, and fear of the flow of life on a psychological level falls away. Remember, biologically, we're still going to defend ourselves from attack. So the biological fear in the moment is not a psychological fear that falls away. But the other fear, including the fear of death, on a psychological level, falls away. And the change that happens when we look at the process, and we look at the process clearly over a period of time, because it's not a spontaneous process. There are moments of what we could call spontaneity that happen in the process. There are aha moments that, when they happen, they're outside of the intellect. There are certain shifts that happen, and they're spontaneous, they're not gradual. But they happen as a result of what came before. And if we don't recognize that, we'll get lost in some idea that thinking is not useful. So when we look at the process over a period of time, which is what it takes, it's gradual over a period of time, the change is all change on the level of thinking, on the level of the brain. Liberation is the liberation from a certain form of relating to life, which is a certain form of thinking, which means the process of liberation is a process of reconditioning on the level of the body and the brain. The brain is part of the body. So liberation happens to the human being. The process of liberation happens on a level of the body. And I know there are other teachings that say something very different. They say it for good reason. They say it because it's necessary to undo a certain block, to undo a certain error. The error of the doer trying to make things happen. So the teaching says, enlightenment is not going to, and that is simply reconditioning the body. So the teaching that says it's not about thinking is actually reconditioning the body to think differently, or to not think. So a teaching that says it's not about thinking is actually conditioning the body-brain. So at some point it's great for us to start seeing what really happens in this process. This process is about the instrument being changed such that what functions through the instrument can at some point become aware of itself. And what functions through the instrument not being aware of itself is simply the presence of certain types of thought that veil it. And so the process of awakening is not something that consciousness does. Consciousness doesn't grow. Consciousness doesn't develop. It's not a movement of consciousness. It's the movement of thought falling away. And so the working mind gets equipped with certain accurate information, and the working mind starts registering what is happening in the flow of life. Awareness is present because awareness needs to be there in order for the flow of life to be recognized. And then it's the working mind that says, this is the flow of life, pleasure or pain. And so when we stub our toe, it's the working mind that says, that's pain in the moment. When the blame arises, it's the working mind that says, that's suffering. The working mind doesn't try to fix the suffering. If that thought, that's blame, then turns into, now how do I get rid of it? It's switched from the working mind into the thinking mind. And so at some point, the working mind sees the error of the thinking mind. And this distinction of working mind and thinking mind it's a conceptual distinction. Actually, there's just the mind, which when we're saying mind, we're talking about the brain here. And so the working mind, the working brain, gets equipped to see the error of itself, the error that the other half of the brain is making, the thinking mind. And when the working mind recognizes the error, that is the reconditioning of the brain. And so the brain stops making errors when the brain recognizes the error that it's making. So it is the working brain, the working mind, that recognizes the malfunction, well, not malfunctioning, because it's not malfunctioning, it's working exactly as it's been programmed to work. The thinking mind is creating suffering because it's being programmed with certain beliefs. The working mind is now being programmed with new information that starts catching the functioning of the thinking mind and seeing the false beliefs at the root of it. And that seeing by the working mind dissolves the thinking mind until such time as the working mind has no more work to do in relation to seeking, because the thinking mind has been undone. There is peace, and therefore the job of the working mind in relation to seeking has stopped. Both the working mind and the thinking mind on a seeking level are now no longer there, and our being is allowed to be there. A connection to what we are at our core is allowed to be there. And so we can call that enlightenment, and we can see that enlightenment is not an intellectual movement. Enlightenment is just our essence being and being recognized, and then life happening while we remain connected to our essence. So enlightenment itself is not an intellectual thing. Enlightenment is not a mental thing. The process of enlightenment is completely happening on the level of the brain and the body. That's an important distinction. Thanks for the question. Did it answer the question? Yeah. So this is what it means. There is no doer doing investigating. There is just the working of a instrument, the brain. The brain, the thinking brain, is not the doer either. It's been programmed to produce thoughts that says, I am the doer, and thoughts that say, I need life to be this way and you shouldn't have acted that way. Thoughts that feel, when they are experienced, those thoughts have a quality of uncomfortableness. Because the thoughts are effectively saying the way things are happening is an attack on who I am, and furthermore the thoughts say this is what I am, and actually it's just a thought, so it's bound to feel uncomfortable. But there's no doer there, there's just the functioning of an instrument that has been designed to output thoughts like that. And the working mind is also the same instrument, the healthy side of it, let's say, that has been conditioned by life to do a whole lot of tasks, to, drive a car and know how to eat and wash yourself and open and close and lock the door and all of these things. Walking, all of that is part of the working mind, and these concepts are being delivered to the working mind, equipping it to function. There's no doer there, there's no individual that decides, well, I'm going to now start thinking about these concepts. Thinking just starts happening when circumstance triggers the working mind. And circumstance, or life I should say in this case, when life triggers the working mind, which could include life including blame, for example, and that blame, when recognized by awareness in the working mind, create a contemplation, potentially, if the working mind has been conditioned that way. So our true nature can witness thinking happening as a happening, both the thinking in the thinking mind, which is suffering, and the thinking in the working mind, which is functional thinking, including contemplation and self-investigation.
What I got a thought right now, it's like when the Ramana puts this "Who am I?" It's just the question that you come from the thinking mind, that what is the thinking mind and
the working mind.
Working mind starts to recognize of thinking mind, and this error can be removed.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you were speaking about love like a pleasure, no, in the moment. So it's general because there is so much impact on the impact. Is so much put on the devotion, in this spiritual processes. Some of them. So love is the essence, like bhakti principle. So it's the same. It's just, in your view, is just the pleasure in the moment, or it has some deeper meaning.
Mm-hmm. So let's distinguish between a feeling of love that arises, that I'm calling a biological arising, part of the flow of life, and pleasure or pain. And I'll also make the distinction that some pleasures that arise, like certain forms, feelings of love, I would say come from our true nature. They come when our true nature is recognized, or when our true nature, not when it's recognized, but when it's able to function, then certain pleasures arise more frequently. And so we can have love, the feeling of love, or the feeling of bliss, or the feeling of joy arise, and it comes from, still I would call it our biological, but our biological when our true nature is also free to flow. So it's still, as I'm categorizing it, a feeling and a pleasure. And even because it comes from our true nature, why I'm not saying that it's enlightenment, those feelings are not enlightenment or knowing oneself, is because they are feelings that come and go, and the feature of our true nature that remains ever present is the underlying peace. So the peace of mind, the peace of our heart, the peace of our nature is something that can remain continuous, unbroken. These arisings of unconditional love, or love for the other, or love for everything, bliss or joy, they arise and they're lovely, they're beautiful, they can bring tears to our eyes. They arise and then at some point they subside. And it's not a tragedy that they subside. They are just an extension, they're a more complex expression of our true nature. The most basic expression of our true nature is simple peace and witnessing. And from time to time it will explode into a more complex expression, which feels like is what I would class on the level of pleasure and pain. A peak pleasure or pain, a mystical pleasure or pain, we could say. So that's various feelings that arise of love. Now there's the path of love, the path, the spiritual path. So we have the path of Jnana, the path of bhakti, the path of yoga, the path of kundalini, all sorts of different paths, tantra. And bhakti is a path where one will surrender to the guru, will devote oneself to God and to the guru, will devote oneself to service of others. And that path is a path that is designed to undo the blocks that are in place, that are the same blocks that are in place for someone who is on the Jnana path or Tantra path. It's just that a particular person is more designed to receive a particular teaching. And so if you've put someone on the Jnana path, which has in principle the same blocks in the system, if you put someone who's on the Jnana path on a bhakti path, that drives them crazy. they're not designed to listen or to do those sort of practices. And similarly, you put someone who's on a bhakti path in a jnana teaching, and they shake their head, going, this is crazy, listening to, because it's not talking to them. So different people find themselves on different paths. Different paths are there because life knows that it's designed things a certain way, and so the solution needs to be catered for the problem. And interestingly, we're talking about jnana and bhakti. It turns out that when you're on a path of jnana, which is wisdom, we start off with jnana, and at the end it merges into bhakti, where there is love, a love of knowing oneself, which in its basic form is the absence of hate, in its most basic form. So to love unconditionally is not a feeling of love as a overwhelming feeling of everything, loving everything unconditionally. It's loving everything where we no longer have the capacity to hate the other. So if you find yourself in the face of being criticized, in the face of being attacked, and we could say, I'll put it this way, you find yourself in the face of being criticized, face of being attacked, and you still love the other, right? Then you know that the blocks, the false ideas of who we are have fallen away, and that you love the other in the face of being attacked by the other, right? That's job done. There's no suffering, even in the face of the other delivering pain to you, attacking you. What I would prefer to say, because I like to, and Ramesh used to be very specific with language, is if we interpret this, is if we find ourselves being attacked by the other and we love the other, what's the mental image that you get? The mental image is that you're being hit or attacked, and our idea of love is like us, we want to hug them, come here, come, I want to hug you. Now, that's not really what this love means. What it means is, I'll frame it the other way, which is that when the other is attacking us and we find ourselves not able to hate the other, right? To walk away and to not have this story of what the other person has done. Right? That to me is to love, to unconditional love is the inability to hate. And so when jnana at the end of the path merges into bhakti, and bhakti, the bhakti path, when a bhakti gets to the end of the path, all the way along there's been lots of bhakti, lots of love arising for the bhakti. At the end, bhakti merges into jnana, so they have the same understanding that the jnana path was delivering to the seeker. And the jnana seeker has the same bhakti in the end that the bhakti had along their way. So the two, bhakti and jnana, are not two. They're two sides of the one coin. And so I guess if we see it this way, we understand that the service aspect, loving, doing everything for the other, is there to break down this obsession with me, me, me. And in jnana, it's saying there is no me, there is no doer. So it's breaking it down in a different way.
Roger, please explain two other words in dictionary of non-duality, ego and mind.
Okay. Well, are we still going to do, or we'll come back to consciousness and awareness, ego and mind. So this talk here is defining some words. Now, why is it important to apply the intellect And so just to put it into context, why that, to see that historically in seeking, the intellect hasn't been treated as a useless thing. So Buddhism, the word Buddhism has in it, it's a derivation of Bodhi, which is intellect. And often we hear in these, in the scriptures, that we have to have a honed intellect, a very sharp intellect. It's that sharp intellect that pierces through the misunderstanding. So that's why there's a reason and there's value in sharpening the intellect. And by defining words, we are sharpening our intellectual capacity. Because if I use a single word, one word, like ego, a word has a definition attached to it. The thing is, a word doesn't have a standard definition. I mean, there's a standard definition in the English language if we used one dictionary. But the thing is, we didn't learn our words by reading a dictionary, and we definitely didn't all have the same dictionary, and not all dictionaries are word for word the same definition as the other. And many words, we haven't even looked at a dictionary definition. Our definition of a word has come based on our hearing its use in certain contexts, and sometimes we use a word completely incorrectly because our understanding of what that word means is wrong. There are some words that can have two definitions, but the point is that what we have to see is that each person has their own definition for a word. And so my definition of a word is going to be different to your definition of a word. It's possibly different. And so if I say, the ego of a sage, you're going to superimpose your definition of ego onto that statement, the ego of a sage. Now, if your definition of the word ego is different to my definition of the word ego, and you superimpose your definition onto the word, which is how we understand sentences, you're going to miss the point maybe, because your definition, if it's different to my definition, is going to translate into a different concept. So in a spiritual teaching, if you find yourself devoted to a spiritual teaching, part of the earnestness we hear about an earnest seeker. Now, an earnest seeker is not someone doesn't become earnest. Someone doesn't apply themselves and become earnest. So you don't get a gold star for becoming earnest because you did it. Earnestness, when we say that is an earnest seeker and that is not an earnest seeker, is simply observing what happens through them, and without judgment. It's like that's a big ball and that's a small ball. There's no judgment about it. It's just a description of the ball relative to a standard. And so an earnest seeker is a label given to a seeker that finds themselves moving in a way that you can see is very dedicated, very genuine, and even when a lot of insight is happening, you could then say that is an earnest seeker, and that's the result of earnest seeking. It's not because there is someone there doing it, it's just that their destiny is to pick up a book and read it and to contemplate about it and to ask questions in satsang and for insight to happen. And someone else might be sitting in satsang and they don't get anything, and when they leave satsang they're not interested in picking up a book, or they pick up a book and nothing really sinks in. And that's not anyone's fault. It's not choice, it's destiny unfolding. So earnestness is just a description of what happens. And when we say there is an earnest seeker, one of the characteristics of an earnest seeker, in my view, is someone who is willing, finds the motivation, which is destiny, to listen to a teaching and become very discerning with exactly what the teaching is saying. It says, no, I want to understand this precisely. So They will listen to a recording 10 times to understand what is being said. And then they'll start saying, I want to know what he means by that word, because he uses it 50 times in a satsang. So I better be sure that I've got the right definition, the definition he's using. And so why this is important is because you can bring two teachings together. Let's say the teachings that Ramana put forward and the teachings that Nisargadatta put forward. And it's quite possible that they will use the word awareness, the same one word, but pointing at different aspects of the manifestation. And so if we take our standard definition of awareness and apply it to one teaching, it might be right for one teaching, but then if we apply it to the other, we've got that other teaching completely wrong. We're going to be hearing it wrong, interpreting it wrong. So if a seeker is listening to two teachings, an earnest seeker will say, my job is to understand the vocabulary as it's used in that teaching, and it's my job to understand the vocabulary as it's used in that other teaching. Which is why sometimes we're told, well, involving yourself in too many teachings can be detrimental as well as positive, because it has its positives in listening to many teachings, because you get to see things being pointed at from many angles, and it sometimes is easier to see what's being pointed at when you see it from many angles. But if you're going to see it accurately from many angles, we're going to have to get the vocabulary right of the different teachings. And so if we don't find ourselves earnest enough to do this contemplating about what the vocabulary is, what the definition behind each word is, then we might be actually causing more problems, because the pointers, we might be hearing them as, and it's pointing out there, and one's pointing here, and we get confused. So sometimes it's better to devote yourself to one or two teachings. Having said that, that's not saying we should, because there's a benefit in exposing ourselves to many teachings. This is just a description of a potential pitfall that can happen. But if you find yourself understanding each teaching really well, then it becomes really powerful. So, I haven't even got onto the description of ego and mind yet, but these are really important distinctions that can help, because, you know, if we miss an underlying principle that carries through to whatever the teaching is saying, then and don't realize that a word has a particular definition, and I have a definition of my own, and I really need to make sure my definition is the same as the definition being used by the teacher. So in this teaching, the word ego is used completely differently to most other teachings. So that's very important to understand. The word ego historically is used to describe that which dissolves at the end of the process of liberation. So it's like the ego dissolves. Now, one of the reasons that Ramesh changed that is because the ego doesn't really define what the ego is. The word ego, E-G-O, you know, it doesn't help us know what it's pointing at. And there isn't a Collins dictionary of spiritual terms out there yet. And I don't know that there should be one, because each teaching doesn't have to comply to a standard form. So the word ego is a bit nondescript. So in this teaching, what traditionally is used as the word ego is substituted for the psychological thinking, or the thinking mind, or the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, the doer. So what was referred to as the ego is referred to here as the doer, or the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. And that is what causes all of the suffering, and that's what dissolves. So Ramesh realized that if we say to the ego, that the problem is the ego does what is most makes sense to happen. The ego says, okay, I'm going to kill myself. It doesn't actually say that. It doesn't realize what it's saying. It's saying, okay, so I now have to dissolve the ego. So the ego is now trying to dissolve the ego. And when the ego is just called the ego, the mistake is not so seeable. Right? So now we call it the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So if the teaching delivers the descriptions and the belief in personal doership grabs hold of the description and says, okay, now I'm going to go and get rid of the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, we can start to see that seems like a belief in personal doership, like that you can do it, and that it's important for the belief in personal doership to dissolve. So if the doer starts trying to do this, which it will never succeed in, because as soon as it starts to try and do it, it is itself being sustained. So the act of the ego trying to kill the ego is an impossibility, because every time it tries to kill the ego, it strengthens the ego. So in this teaching, the word ego is referred to the person. Not the person that dissolves, but the person that will remain even after enlightenment. So it says Ramana, even after enlightenment, was an ego. Ramana didn't have an ego. Ramana is an ego. Ramesh is an ego. Roger is an ego. Milosh is an ego. So an ego refers to the combination of the body and the impersonal consciousness of Source that links to the body and functions through that body as personal consciousness. So the ego is not something that dissolves. It's not something that dies. The ego dies at the point of physical death. Or you can say the ego is not there in deep sleep or in meditation. Because, well, the awareness isn't there in deep sleep or meditation. So the ego, which is a combination of the body and consciousness of Source functioning through the body as personal consciousness, that is the ego. And so the difference, what is the difference before and after enlightenment? The difference is before enlightenment there is an ego with the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, and after there is an ego without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. So what has dissolved is the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, which is simply a set of beliefs contained in the thinking mind. And how it dissolves is not through the belief in personal doership doing anything, but it's dissolved through life-delivering new conditioning that effectively erases the belief from the thinking mind. And so the realization that the sage has, once the sage, which is an ego without the sense of personal doership, the realization is that I am always connected to Source. I've always been connected to Source. Everything that has ever happened through me was a happening. Everything that is happening through everyone else is a happening. There never was a doer, but there was and there is an ego or a person. The person hasn't dissolved. The body is still there. The body still has identification with name and form. So when Ramana was called, he would turn his head and say, yes, how can I help you? So the identification with name and form is there. The ego is there. But in the sage, it's no longer believed to be as concrete and separate as it's believed to be before that recognition. And so there's the analogy that Ramana says, the ego of a sage. So it didn't say that the ego has dissolved. The ego of a sage is like the remnants of a burnt rope. So it's just the outline. It can't be used to tie anyone up, Ramesh would say. Meaning that the ego, the sage, is not interested in trying to get people to do, trying to control people. But the ego is still there, or the sage is the ego. And is that enough on ego? Mind, also a tricky thing, because we use the word mind interchangeably with thinking sometimes. So we would say, we can, if the mind gets too busy, we could say. And so in that case, it's clear that the word mind is being used to refer to thinking. Whereas actually mind is a much larger or much broader function than just thinking. In the broader sense, mind is that in which everything arises. The nature of mind is consciousness. And so the manifestation is an arising in consciousness or an arising in mind. So if you close your eyes and you become aware of what you would call your eyelids, the back of your eyelids. Maybe you realize it's not the back of your eyelids, there's this vast open space with no boundaries. And if you find that meditation can happen for you, where you sink deeper and deeper, and any ideas of a body being there, and a room being there, an inside and an outside being there, if all that falls away, the experience in that moment, if there is presence with the experience, is an experience of formless, spaceless space, in which all experience arises. So that formless space, we could say, is mind, and the manifestation as it arises in that space, which in a meditation is a very basic form of manifestation, maybe some sound. And so in this moment, my voice is arising in that space as a sound. And so we see that all experience arises in this formless consciousness, this spaceless space. And so mind, the nature of mind is consciousness. So mind is not something that thinks, but rather mind is something or nothing that registers the whole experience as it arises moment after moment after moment. So mind is that in which the experience arises. And so if what we call opening our eyes happens now, the objects that arise in mind are radically different. The whole, what we call the daily life experience, has come into existence again. And this experience, including the body as part of that experience, is arising in the mind that is formless space, that contains the whole experience and is aware of the experience. So if we close our eyes, the experience changes radically, and only if we become conditioned in such a way to understand that there are a whole lot of beliefs about the nature of experience and the nature of life that get carried into the meditation space. Beliefs that prevent us from seeing what is there clearly, like beliefs that I am sitting in a chair, that there is an inside and an outside, that the ears are what hear and it's the nose that smells. If all of those beliefs are seen to be beliefs, and that maybe what registers experience is not the body, what registers experience is not the senses, what registers experience is this formless awareness. which we could call mind. Mind is that in which the whole experience, including the body, arises. Mind is that which registers the thinking. Mind is that which registers emotions. Mind is that which registers the body. And mind is that which registers all of the physical objects, or those things that appear to be physical objects. So mind is not something. Mind is not the brain. The brain is part of the body, which is just an object arising in mind. And when I'm talking about mind, I'm not talking about an individual's mind, but rather the only mind that there is, which is the mind of Source, that is what is aware of each moment as it arises. And that awareness of each moment can sound like, oh, that would be interesting to know what God's awareness in each moment is. It would be interesting to know what the awareness of the mind, this universal mind is. And the funny thing is that you know what the awareness of the universal mind is. The awareness of the universal mind is the awareness that you have right now. The awareness of this room. That is the awareness of the mind in which this room as an experience arises. You don't need to think, oh, I wonder what the awareness of God is like. The awareness of God is right here. God is functioning through the body as awareness. So we can either say that the consciousness is functioning through the body, or take the more holistic or bigger picture view, which says the whole universe, the whole experience in this moment arises inside mind and is witnessed by mind. So we have these, either the more spacious sort of witnessing perspective of the present moment experience, or we can become aware of awareness as it functions through the body. It's the same awareness in two different forms, a bit like breathing. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. The inhale, we could say, is witnessing from a sort of out-of-body perspective, where we feel like we are the awareness that is not located anywhere, but everywhere. Or the exhale is where that awareness feels like it comes into the body and functions out of the body. And it's not that enlightenment is the big picture witnessing view, and when it comes into the body, well, that's unenlightenment. The enlightened living is both, either or both. Why it's not, when it comes into the body, it's not a problem, because the beliefs in personal doership are no longer in the body. And so if it's functioning as if it's the body, from the perspective of viewing life from the body, that's not contracted in the way that it used to be contracted when the beliefs of personal doership was there. So it's the beliefs in personal doership and attachment that create this energetic contraction that makes us feel disconnected and lost and uncomfortable. Once those are gone from the body, consciousness doesn't have to experience life from an out-of-body perspective all the time. It can come back into the body, function through the body. Just like in the night dream that we're saying, the night dream is always an arising in consciousness, but the dream is experienced from the perspective of the individual, from the perspective of the body, consciousness functioning through the body. So our understanding of mind to start with is either thinking or an individual mind. We can say an individual mind in which thoughts arise, in which feelings arise. But if we broaden it out, the mind is that in which the momentary experience arises, the whole experience, which includes the body as part of the experience.
I'm more confused than earlier. I hope it's good news.
So If you want, you can give me your description or definition of mind, the one that, not what I've just said, it's not about matching the two. And then I can say, okay, so I would use the word such and such for what you're using.
When you give that description of the mind, I don't see difference between awareness and mind.
There is no difference.
Okay.
Because the nature of mind is consciousness, and the two basic functions of consciousness are, on the one hand, awareness, and on the other hand, the sense of being, existence. So if the nature of mind is consciousness, and the nature of consciousness is awareness, then really the nature of mind is awareness as well. They're all interchangeable words. So spot on, there's no difference. I can interchange the use of the word mind and awareness. So we'll do that. It's good to define it so that then when we hear the word mind, we can say, oh, is he talking about the mind in which everything arises? Remember, I'm not talking about the personal mind, more like the mind that is the mind of the universe, which is what actually we come to know ourselves as, the awareness which registers the experience that is made of awareness and arises in awareness.
Obviously, my definition I understand as a mind is more personal. Mind is a series of thoughts or mechanism that mix in some way thoughts and emotions. And
So the experience as it's designed to arise in the mind of God, in the moment, is designed to be an experience that is of a world and of a separate character in that world, and a separate character that has a brain that thinks and produces thoughts, and a nervous system that's linked to the brain that produces feelings as in conjunction with the brain. And so that experience creates the impression that there is a personal mind. So when we go to our experience, we think about, we have this universal mind is hard to imagine, or not even imagine, we don't have a frame of reference, because the experience is often designed, or our experience of the experience is one of an objective world that isn't arising in a mind, it's a building on a piece of land, right? That's, there's a building over there, there's a road, it's on a piece of land. It's not arising in any mind, it's an objective reality. That's how the experience of life is designed to be experienced. And within that, the experience is an experience of a body as a physical thing, an objective reality, and that body, separate from the building, has the capacity to create thoughts within itself that are registered by the personal mind. When the experience expands, in a sense, such that, well, the experience doesn't expand, when the experience changes so that it becomes apparent that the awareness that I thought was my awareness is actually an awareness that extends to the limit of the experience, then the body becomes seen not as the subject, or not as the subject, but as an object. So the physical body, when it fits into this greater field of awareness, is seen to be an object, not the subject, an object in the experience. And then thoughts, when they arise, are not seen to be the body's thoughts, but thoughts arising in the experience. And emotions, when they arise, are not seen to be the body's emotions, but emotions arising as part of the experience. And so from that perspective, what we were forced to see as my personal mind has now expanded to be a mind that includes everything. And then we realize, it only felt like a personal mind because the experience, which was always arising in the universal mind, The experience was designed to not be experienced as something arising in a universal mind, to be designed to feel like I'm an objective individual in an objective reality with a mind that belongs to this person. And so even with this understanding, we can still use mind interchangeably, because once this shift happens, which doesn't necessarily have to happen, it's a particular path for some people, this awakening into this bigger awareness is not the only way that the beliefs in personal doership and attachment to outcome can fall away. So it doesn't have to happen. But if it does happen, we will still then have the experience of when we drop the realization, because the realization happens and we don't have to keep insisting on it being there, then the experience comes back and it feels like, yes, I have to live life as if I am Roger in an objective world, as if I am the thinker, as if I am the doer. So then it comes back and it feels like, yes, the thoughts are arising in my mind, in the mind of Roger. And so then I could say, I can use language and say, yeah, a thought came to mind. And in that case, I'm sort of talking about Roger's mind, which doesn't really exist as just Roger's mind. But I can still, because it feels like that, it feels like, oh, I spent 15 minutes contemplating about such and such. And so it feels like Roger was thinking, without me forgetting the fact that actually it's all an experience, and the thinking that feels like Roger is thinking happening. But still, I'm going to live the rest of my life feeling like I am Roger that thinks. And so then we can use the word mind in the way you've got a definition of it, but at the same time without it being limiting it to just that experience or that use of the word mind.
Yeah, no, we may open Pandora's box. You said that brain produces thoughts.
Yeah. So, is that enough of?
Actually, for example, we see that we can catch some other's thoughts or whatever. Brain produces thoughts out of nowhere, or is it some kind of production plant for consciousness? Or
okay,
when you said produce thoughts, there is impression in me that they come from nowhere.
So there's, once again, different teachings that put forward different concepts in order to undo certain mistakes that are in place. So you can describe thoughts from two different perspectives. If we look at life, which is a spontaneous arising, like a dream at night, when we look at it as a dream, all there is this. There is no past and no future, and there is no cause and effect in a dream. In a dream, there's a momentary arising. A cause and effect requires a past and a future for there to really be cause and effect. But the fact is that the dream, as it unfolds as a story, unfolds as if cause and effect is real in the dream, and the same in life. And so, from one perspective, when we're looking at this moment as all there is, if I were to say to someone who's teaching from the other perspective that your thoughts are produced by the brain, they could very rightly say to me, and in fact I put forward both views, but we just need to make it clear that they're both views from different angles. So they could rightly say to me, you're making an assumption, there is a belief here that your thoughts come from a brain, and I've heard your concept. It says that the thoughts come from a brain that is designed based on its genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it's a machine, is what is being said, that has been designed by life based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, and that machine is producing thoughts. And they'll say, that sounds like a belief to me. Are you sure? And I would say, well, actually it's not a belief, because I know that beliefs, which is a concept that has been held onto as an absolute, this is absolutely how it is, that is always a mistake, because a concept is relative, and to the extent that we hold a relative concept absolutely, we're making a mistake. So the first point I would make is to say, no, I don't hold it as a belief. It is a concept that is there as part of a teaching to undo something, to undo an error. It's a description. And furthermore, it's not just a handy concept to undo something, it's also accurate based on certain observations of life. The observation whereby we can see the correlation between a thought that arises and the apparent past that someone has gone through, the apparent genes and up-to-date conditioning, and within the story of life, scientists can cut the skull open and show you here's a brain, and they can put nodes on the head and see that when someone thinks, there is a correlating brain activity. Right? Now, all of that, if it's part of an illusion of life, doesn't mean it's true. It just means life is designed to appear to be based on cause and effect. And so, because the illusion is designed to appear to be based on cause and effect, we can put forward a description of thinking being a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning. We can put forward the concept that thoughts always arise from a brain. If the brain is dead, then thoughts don't arise. So that's valid. If we hold on to that as the only description and the truth, then the teacher probably isn't liberated. So then we go to the other perspective, where we say, let's stick with the present moment and not believe any concepts that are not verifiable in this moment. So if we do that, and let's say you're asked to close your eyes, and the thought arises. So if I ask you, what's your name? The thought arises. Roger has asked me what my name is. Should I answer this question, or is he just using a hypothetical? If I answer this question, my name is Miloš. All of that happens. And so if you're in the meditation and I say, what's your name? You notice a thought, a series of thoughts arises. And I can say, where did that arise from? And you might say, it arose from my brain. I said, no. Let's remain present with the experience as it is right now. Only what you can verify. Don't hold on to any concepts from the past. So you close your eyes again and I say, where did the thought come from? And from your experience, you might say, well, it came out of nowhere. It just popped into consciousness, and then it wasn't there anymore. So it subsided back into consciousness. So yeah, that's right. So your thought actually comes out of nowhere and subsides back into nowhere. So if you close your eyes again, I say, where did that sound come from? And you might say, well, you clapped your hands. I say, no, based on your experience, forgetting about any concepts about how life works, just based from your experience. Where did the sound come from? And then you might say, well, actually it just it just popped into consciousness as an object, which we call sound, and then it subsided again. And so, yes, you see, everything is an arising out of consciousness. It's a spontaneous arising that has nothing to do with any imagined past. Everything is happening right now. This is all there is. Everything spontaneously arises and spontaneously subsides. Cause and effect is an illusion within that which spontaneously arises and spontaneously subsides. So on this basis, if someone says, well, thoughts come from the brain, I say, no, that's a concept based on cause and effect. From your own experience, the moment is a spontaneous arising. Thoughts arise and then subside. Just like quantum physics tells us that all matter comes out of nothing and subsides back into nothing. So this is, once again, if we never realize why we can describe things from different angles, then we can listen to different teachings and we go and we think, this is confusing. Someone tells me that the thoughts are coming out of nowhere, and another teacher is telling me that the thoughts come from my brain. That other teacher that says that thoughts come out of nowhere says there's no brain. Show me the brain right now, find your brain. And you go, what should I listen? Who should I believe? Well, if we can see why a teaching is coming from different angles and we put them both together, and we see, this is a spontaneous arising in the present moment, but the story that is part of this spontaneous arising is a story of cause and effect. And so the teachings, which I have a lot of respect for, in fact, I put them forward, that says time and space is not real. Past and future don't exist. Right? That's when we come to see the fundamental nature of experience. But once that's seen and totally integrated, if someone tells me, what are you doing for dinner? Then I say, I'm going out to such and such a restaurant for dinner. So my response is a response that lives as if time and space is real. Right? So we have to realize this is a teaching that's trying to do something, but then the very teacher that is so insistent that there is no time and space, still after liberation, after having this realization that time and space isn't real, still lives their life as if time and space is real, lives their life as if cause and effect are real. So when they want to dry their clothes, they put them on the line, following laws of cause and effect. And when they say, all there is this, which is true, you still see them get up from their chair and go somewhere, and you say, where are you going? And they go, I need to go to the toilet. And so you can see that they're functioning based on the assumption that there is a here and a there, and that when they get to the theoretical there will be a toilet. And so then we can start to see, we just start to understand more and more, even what teaching is. What is a teaching? It's doing a job. And to the extent that we can understand a particular teaching and see what job it's trying to do, then we won't necessarily go around criticizing teachings just because they're different to a teaching that we put forward or a teaching we resonate with. We'll understand. So my view in particular is if I see another teaching and it says something different to what I say, my first question is, why is it saying that? What block is it trying to undo? Because we'll see in many teachings, they will put forward one concept to one person to undo one block, and to another person they'll say something that sounds contradictory. And if we wonder why it's contradictory without understanding that a teaching is a set of concepts, not the truth, a teacher is never uttering truth. And the teaching says, don't take this concept as a truth. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. We've heard many times this analogy of don't mistake the finger pointing at the moon as the moon itself. So the concepts are pointers. So these are what we need to understand as earnest seekers. It's come to understand teachings on this level. And this understanding of even the process of teaching, the process of enlightenment, that comes simply as we observe our own change, comes as we observe what is happening and maybe use pointers such as this discussion to help our working mind and our attention land on things. The more we understand even teachings, the quicker the process unfolds. So where do thoughts come from? The brain, or do they arise out of nothing? Both. They are two perspectives of seeing what is. What is a spontaneous arising in consciousness, but it's a spontaneous arising designed to specifically be, even after enlightenment, an experience of time and space and cause and effect. Just like, what is the universe? Is it a creation or is it evolution? It's both. It's a creation designed to be a story of evolution. I use my hands a lot, I notice. Biological reaction, a happening.
Yeah, obviously nobody have questions. You mentioned a few times that time and the space doesn't exist, don't exist. Would you elaborate more?
Yes. So from the awakening perspective, where the consciousness in which the experience arises, when that becomes clear, it becomes clear that in deep sleep, the experience collapses. It's not present. In the waking state, if we take away certain objects, the notion of time falls away when the world is present. So we can start to see that, so if you sit really still and look out of the window, can you prove that the image that you see is three-dimensional? Can you prove that there is space between here and the building? So in certain circumstances, if the experience is a certain way, and we just look at it, we don't know whether it's two-dimensional or three-dimensional. So if our hand is moving, there is certain objects in the experience that make space evident and time evident. It takes time to move our hand through space. But as certain objects of experience fall away, like the hand moving, and we just sit still and look out of a window, you can draw a picture with perspective. So a picture can look three-dimensional, but it's only two-dimensional. And so if we're not verifying by the experience being a certain way, then time and space start to collapse. In a deep meditation, when a lot of objects fall away, it's described as spaceless space and no time. And the nature of life, or the nature of source, maybe you could say, the nature of the manifestation is often described as infinite and eternal. Now, often our understanding of what that definition of infinite and eternal is, we think infinite is infinite amount of space and eternal is infinite amount of time. But actually the definition of infinite and eternal is the absence of space and the absence of time. And so how we can come to see this even more tangibly maybe is if we go back to the night dream and we realize that there is mind that has no experience in it at some point, let's say in deep sleep, mind at rest. And at some point, mind at rest explodes into manifestation. The night dream comes into existence. And in the night dream, which is an experience in mind, time and space has suddenly burst into existence with the presence of the experience as it is. When the experience, the night dream, collapses back into nothing, time and space collapses with it. And so if we come to see that our experience of life is an experience arising in consciousness that collapses when we go into deep sleep, that the whole universe is not existent when deep sleep is present, or not deep sleep is present. When there is deep sleep, there is no experience present. So then we can start to see, time and space collapse with the experience. Just like when you look at a night dream, it's much more evident that an experience includes time and space in it. But time and space is not the framework in which the experience arises. The framework is eternity and infinity. The framework is consciousness that in its resting form doesn't include a framework of time and space. But as soon as a particular experience arises in that framework of consciousness, time and space come into existence with the appearance of manifestation. And so science, when it observes the experience, now starts to say, well, time and space is less constant than we think. And so anything that is changing is ultimately not real. So the definition of real when it comes to quantum or science on an absolute level, and spirituality, when we come to spirituality, the definition of real is that which doesn't change, that which doesn't come and go. The time comes and goes with the experience. Yet we live life in this experience. And so from practical perspective, other than once the realization is that this is not as real as it seems, which simply at the end of the day is there to dissolve the belief of doership which comes from seeing life a particular way. Once that's dissolved, a connection to source, a connection to self is always there, unobstructed by these beliefs that were there previously. And in practical terms, we have to live in this experience for as long as the experience is present, until the body and the experience die. And so we live as if time and space are real. As if. Meaning, for all practical purposes, I will look at my watch and plan according to time schedules. And live as if it's real, knowing that deep down the whole manifestation is temporary, that the body is part of the temporary manifestation, and that the framework of time and space only exists within the manifestation, not outside of the manifestation. Imagine yourself falling through, this is an interesting meditation, falling through space. Let's say you've been dropped out of a spaceship and you're falling through space, and you're in a particular part of space where there are no planets, no stars, no rocks, and the spaceship has gone. And you're just there in space with no frame of reference for anything, because there's nothing there. And you're floating or falling, you don't know whether you're falling or not, because in space there's no wind, because there's no atmosphere. So you've got no frame of reference of falling or feeling anything on your body. And the universe is that at the moment, that emptiness. So you can meditate on an imagined environment with absolutely no objects to create a relative perspective, you relative to another object. And that can help break down what we think of as something relative, time and space, and realize that time and space exists because of all the objects that tell us about time and space, and the movement that is a movement that seems to be through space, which is really all the objects around me moving in the experience, to indicate or to appear like I'm moving through space. So like a cartoon that has a whole lot of frames, it appears that there is movement, but actually it's a whole sequence of different frames. So the experience is designed when there are objects to create the impression of movement and time and space. And it becomes very different when when we imagine an environment that has no objects around to create a juxtaposition. It's a little complex. Time and space not being real. I'm not a physicist, so that's the best I can do.
I just wanted to confirm something earlier when you were defining mind and describing the universal mind as the awareness in which everything appears. So that would be in line with what you were explaining this morning about the world being a dream, as in the world would be like a dream of this universal mind in the same way that we would have a night dream of the individual mind.
Yes, but even when we look at it, the night dream is seen to actually also be in the universal mind. It replaces this experience, where it becomes relegated to an experience that seems to happen in the individual's mind, which it never does. There only is universal mind. So this experience collapses and is replaced by the dream experience. So in the moment of the dream, all that you're aware of is the dream. It fills the entire universal mind. In that moment is what we will then come to call a night dream. And then when the night dream collapses and what we call waking up happens, is the waking state comes back. It fills the universal mind. And that experience that comes back, that fills the universal mind, includes the sensation of an individual waking up in an objective world, which is really just, as we're now saying, an experience arising in the universal mind. But it's designed to create the impression of an individual waking up in a bed, which is designed based on our memory to be the bed that I went to sleep in, and that was here all along while I was having a dream in my own mind. So while the dream is there, actually it is all there is, and it only gets relegated into the category of a night dream in my personal mind once the experience of a dream collapses and this experience takes its place, and the experience implies, it was just a dream in my individual head or individual mind.
So is there, when, I can't speak from personal experience, but I've heard accounts of people who, while they're dreaming, realize that they're dreaming. And they can sort of maybe experiment to verify that this is a dream, and then they have fun in the dream. Is it important, is there any value to conducting similar experiments to see that this world that we take as an objective reality is also not so objective? And also, if we realize that this world that we take to be objective reality is in fact more illusory than we think, what does that say about reality itself? Like, if we're taking this to be reality and it turns out it's not, then you were saying earlier, reality is that which does not change. So I assume there is some revelation of what then reality is, if we can see that this...
Yeah, do you want to know what my definition of reality is?
Yes, please.
Yeah, there is no reality.
That's what it seems like. That ultimately you're saying that there is no
There's
reality.
only ever experience that is always changing. And if I was forced to put a label of reality on something, so call something reality, it would be nothing. It would be the nothing, which is that into which the experience collapses and from which the experience burst forth, which you could call the unmanifest or consciousness at rest. Now, consciousness at rest, even though I put words onto it, is pure potentiality, potential energy. The word potential is interesting. If we really understand potential, it means has the potential for. It's potential energy, which means can't even be measured. So it's not dead, because if it was dead, it wouldn't have potential. But it's potential which is nothing until it manifests, until it actualizes. So when that potential energy or consciousness at rest, or the unmanifest, absolute nothing, not even awareness of itself. In the unmanifest, God doesn't even know itself. When that explodes into manifestation, the manifestation is essentially experience arising inside consciousness in movement. So consciousness at rest, pure potentiality, has exploded into consciousness in movement. And the movement is this imagination in mind. And so whenever there is manifestation, it is experience. So we never wake up out of the dream. We never wake up out of experience. We always wake up to the fact it is experience. And even if there is this shift from subject-object relationship to an experience of oneness where subject-object relationship falls away, we're prone to call that reality and say, oh, experience fell away, so Roger is wrong. There isn't just experience. There can be this other, which is the absence of experience, because a lot of people's definition of experience is the presence of subject-object relationship, separation, the sense of separation. And so then another experience happens, an experience of oneness that doesn't have that characteristic to it, and people will claim that is reality. To me, that's still the manifestation. It is an experience that is just being created to feel different to the experience we're used to. It's an experience that is not created to be experienced as duality, and we could say it's an experience that is designed to be experienced as oneness, no separation. But it's an experience of oneness. It's an experience in consciousness. It's the manifestation at that point in time that at some point collapses back to nothing. And so what someone calls reality is just an experience that is designed to be felt, experienced radically differently. And so that to me still fits into the category of not real, not reality. And whenever we experience anything, even if we experienced, the most amazing meditation or peak experience, that's the manifestation, that's experience designed to be as amazing as it is, as profound as it is. And when that collapses back to nothing, which is the absence of experience, I would call that the ground of reality. But when we look at it, we find it is nothing. So nothing is reality.
So in this teaching, when you use the word awareness, so it seems like awareness and the sense of I am are components of this consciousness in movement.
Yes, they're the fundamental aspects of consciousness and movement. And even they fall away when consciousness in movement goes into consciousness at rest.
Which is why you say that awareness disappears when the object disappears.
Yeah, and you know, obviously a lot of people that have had deep realizations will argue at this point. And when we can put forward some fairly simple logic that can show that there's a belief there, and I'm not holding what I'm saying as absolute truth, but I'm saying it makes a whole lot more, it's so much more poetic to me that reality, as far back as you can go, is absolute nothing. Even awareness not aware of itself. So a lot of teachings which are doing a job won't necessarily go that far back, and they will say that reality or awareness is the absolute. It's a concept, remember. Don't take a concept as truth. It's there to do a job, and some teachings won't tell you not to take it as truth because it's not helpful in that teaching to say that. And another teaching will tell you that. And so if someone were to argue, no, awareness is always present, the absolute is awareness, we can say, so you believe that because a teaching has told you that, and then you've awoken, there's been an experience or a shift that shows you that awareness is ever present and the content of experience is always changing. And so we come up with this, we can say with the definition that which is ever present or unchanging is real. And so we then conclude our awareness is the background of everything that arises. It's ever present and unchanging. But we haven't looked at an experience where experience collapses and seen, well, I've just been looking at all experience, and it's true. Whenever in our experience, awareness is always present with experience. You can't have an experience with the non-presence of awareness. So we have to conclude that in my experience, awareness is ever present. But what about if experience collapses?
When does that happen, the collapse? Does that ever happen? The collapsing of experience?
Yeah, it's good if you use that because this is interesting for people.
When does this collapse happen of experience? Does it ever happen?
Well,
it seems like it's always, this experience is always on, always something is happening.
In our experience, it's always on, because by definition, if experience collapses, and the collapse of experience is, as I'm putting forward the concept of, that the collapse of experience is even the absence of awareness, then obviously we're not going to be able to, there isn't going to be an awareness of the absence of experience. Because the absence of experience means the absence, according to this concept, means the absence of awareness. And if there's the absence of awareness, there can't be awareness of no experience. There can't be awareness of no awareness. So by default, this absolute means that we'll never know it.
It's more like a speculation, this collapse, because we can never experience, even the state of deep sleep, we cannot experience it, we can...
True. So, yes, so this we start getting into very, we have to hold concepts correctly here, without turning them into beliefs. So I'm not saying this is truth, but I'm saying that when my concept that awareness is ever present fell away, because Ramesh and I had a discussion about this, and this was the third of several issues that I had an issue with and was convinced Ramesh was incorrect about. And at some point, a click happened, and I realized that I was holding on to a belief, and that what he was saying was made fit much better. So when the belief that awareness is always there fell away for me, the process moved ahead in leaps and bounds. So what I do know is that holding the belief that awareness is ever present is a terrible obstacle. You could hold the concept, if we're familiar with the difference between holding a concept and holding a belief, we can hold the concept that says awareness is ever present, but whoever holds that concept will have to agree, I can't be sure of that. Because if awareness collapses, it would collapse without them knowing. Right? So let's see where it starts to make sense based on the non-dual understanding to conclude that awareness actually collapses. And where it makes sense is that a very deep non-dual realization is that experience, so we start off saying experience has a background of consciousness. There is a background of consciousness, the substratum, and all content arises in that background. Now, that's very useful to create a distinction where awareness and the content can start to be seen as separate in a way. But as you can see, it creates this conceptual separation of the content and the background of awareness. Further down the track, the realization, the non-dual realization is that actually they're not two. The content and the awareness are intrinsically, fundamentally, intrinsically not two. What does that say about when no one has an argument with the fact that content is ever changing? The fact that content is ever changing means that content is effectively collapsing and re-emerging, collapsing and re-emerging, collapsing and re-emerging on such a fast basis.
Now I understand. So I mean, moment to moment, it's like burning of a candle. It gives them impression that the flame is permanent, but actually it's every second it's renewing itself. So this consciousness could be collapsing and coming again in every moment. Now
it
I
has
understand.
to be.
Yes, of course.
If the experience is collapsing every moment, the consciousness which is not separate from it has to collapse with it. If we say it doesn't, if someone is arguing against me, they're not holding on to the not to principle. So this background is a concept in teaching that is helpful, and at some point it needs to be transcended. It gets transcended, and a lot of people see, it's not separate, there isn't a separate background. But then the next step of concluding that even awareness collapses, and that the absolute is not awareness. The absolute is potentiality, where even the absolute is not aware of itself.
So there is no absolute ground to hold on to. Maybe the sense of I, the ego, wants to hold on to something, some eternal consciousness, which is like the substratum of everything, which is eternal, which would offer the ego some sense of eternal comfort and peace. And this is what the seeker is asking for. But actually there is no such thing in life. There is just this, like a river, this constant change, this constant collapsing and exploding back into
exactly.
In this is now I understand. It's an immense sense of freedom in this whole happening.
And why, even though it collapses into nothing, why it's not scary from the realization point is that the I that is ever present in the manifestation, and so the I is always collapsing with awareness as well.
Because then there is nobody to be afraid. If the I collapses, then there is no I which could be afraid of this, which would prefer one phenomena or another.
That's true.
It's just it disappears into this happening.
So clearly, there's no in unmanifest. There is no potential for fear. Exactly what you just said. But the other thing to realize, and this is how this understanding can become clear, is if we come to know the I completely by being I, which is not something we do, right? It happens when certain beliefs fall away. We be I. If you know I, and we know life, it's enough to know that. It informs us of what life and I is also not separate from. And we're saying that it comes out of the absolute. So when we know the I, it informs us of what is before the I. Not in a way that we can experience or know intellectually absolutely, but somehow there is a movement that moves us past the belief that the absolute is awareness all the time, always aware, even aware of nothing. And why there's no fear when the I drops away is because we know the I is dropping away into what we really are at our source when it drops into nothing. It drops into nothing, which is the potential for I. So the I hasn't been, it's dissolved when it goes to the unmanifest, but not in a way where it has been attacked. It has dissolved back into its source at rest. And so there's no fear of I dissolving, because in a sense there is an eternal.
Like electricity, 0 and 1, it oscillates from 0 to 1, from 0 to 1. And there is nothing outside this oscillation. So
That's perfect.
maybe the I would be with the number 1. But the 0, well, this is impossible to put in words. I mean,
this is it. But I use, that's binary is one of the examples I use for this. If you know the 1 absolutely, the 1 and the 0 are not separate. So if you come to know 1 absolutely as it can be known, we are informed about 0, which is really just the absence of 1. So it's what you're clicking, what you're getting is this is very fine. It's good.
I just want to say it's like remembering and forgetting. It's not separate.
Mm-hmm.
It's just remembering, and then forgetting.
Yeah, they're two sides of one.
Two sides
thing.
of one. Yeah.
Yeah. And at some point, it's important and useful for us to have a concept that awareness is the absolute. That's why teachings have that concept there, because it's more useful at a certain stage to have awareness as the absolute than have absolute nothing as the absolute. It's a more useful stepping stone for the mind to step onto, and then even that gets taken away. So, thank you.